All right, this is a demonstration for our Double Chocolate Walnut Biscotti. We're making a half batch, which is still going to produce a pretty decent amount. The walnuts that in a previous video we showed you how to get toasted and rub the skins off have already been chopped. That's half a cup. We have to get some dry ingredients together to go ahead and get those sifted. And that would be 1 cup of flour. So remember that we will scoop this in loosely. And go ahead and put a strainer or a sieve to catch your stuff. Break things up. So off camera perhaps, but to the top, loose. 1 cup and leveled off. That can go in. And the thing also about the sifting is the small amount of cocoa powder, which is going to be a 1/4 cup, is going to get better incorporated into the mix. So it is a 1/4 cup. And that will get leveled off. There is a half teaspoon of salt. And there's also a half teaspoon of baking soda, not baking powder, baking soda. And so baking soda is a base. It needs an acid to react with it to make bubbles to give lift. There is potentially acid in the cocoa, depends how it's been processed. That's something more complex than to go into about Dutch processed cocoa. But for sure, there's acid in the sugar that is elsewhere in the recipe. And that is enough to react to make the baking soda rise. So make sure you read the recipe to know which leavening agent you're using and use the right one. All right, so that is our dry ingredients. The baking soda, salt, flour, and cocoa powder. Now changing our focus on the KitchenAid bowl, we have 3 tablespoons of butter, so a small amount of fat, along with half a cup of sugar. Okay, that's going to get creamed together. So we can use a 1/4 cup twice, but this is going to get creamed together with a flat paddle, and then we'll be adding in an egg. Okay, so that butter's already softened, creamed together. Looks a little clumpy when the moisture from the egg hits. We're going to be fine. Now, if you're making our traditional biscotti with almonds or walnuts, there's mention in the video tutorial and perhaps in the print that a true traditional biscotti does not use butter. It is all egg. Butter was quite a luxury when biscottis were first introduced centuries ago, and butter can also potentially turn rancid. So that fat might go bad, and these were meant to be cookies that could be kept for long storage. So they just went with egg, but this recipe calls for butter, and we're gonna stick with that because it's what it's asking for. So we mix in the egg. That is meant to be light and fluffy. All right, we're about ready to finish our dough. First, we are going to get our chocolate chips out. That will explain why this is the double chocolate. There's chocolate in the cocoa powder, which is not something you want to put in the milk. For chocolate milk, it can be very, very bitter. There's no sugar, but the chocolate chip does have sweetness, and there's sugar in the rest of the recipe. So 6 tablespoons, quickest way perhaps to measure that out would be a 1/4 cup, which is equal to 4 tablespoons, plus a 1/5 and 1/6. Now this recipe does not ask for any vanilla, so we're not going to be adding that in, improvising. But the last part of it is to add in our flour and mix this up into a dough. Our flour, cocoa powder, salt, baking soda mix and then finish by adding in the walnuts and the chocolate chips once we get this into a dough. So we mix this up. Hopefully comes together into a consistent dough. If we need to stop, to scrape down the sides, we can do so. That seemed to do the trick. Definitely looks kind of more like mud, but it's our walnuts and the chocolate chips that get added in on low. Mix this all together. We've got a dough. Okay, this has to get shaped into a log. This will be different shape than what the other biscottis asked for. About 2 inches wide, 6 to 7 inches long. Okay, but they're going to be smaller, perhaps only being 2 inches across. We've got the chocolate chips that we don't want to get burned by being too big a cookie. Okay, so if we get this all into one consistent ball, okay, and we feel like the nuts and the chocolate chips have been mixed throughout, then we're going to transition this to our baking sheet. This is a baking sheet that has a sill pad on top. Okay. And these were going to be, say, 2 inches across. You can go as wide as the hand, closer to 3.5, 4. And it is actually quite a bit bigger or longer than 6 to 7 inches. So and this represented that, looking off a recipe off to the side. I'm going to say I want this to be about the width of my hand, and as long as it needs to be. But the important thing is that it's one consistent log so that they bake evenly. I'll come around and double check that before they go in. This is a nice dough to work with, not as wet as our almond and walnut biscotti recipe that we also use. Okay, so that's our consistent log. Again, we use a sill pat. There's no need to spray. Don't want to spray, it would spread out. But this sill pat is gonna let this thing bake up and easily remove at the end of the baking time. Baking time at 350, suggested 35 minutes till it's slightly firm to the touch. I actually start checking it based on the way I shaped it at about 30. All right, into the oven. And we're back. This took about 25, almost 30 minutes to get this baked. When it comes out, we want this to go down a few minutes on a cooling rack. And we'll be taking this off the sill pat to put it on the cooling rack as well. But we can start with the sheet pan up off the surface of the table. And I misspoke earlier when we talked about the shape of this because this was cut in half, but it really was supposed to be a 12-inch, so maybe about out to here, 2-inch wide log. But this is still going to produce quite a few cookies. So we're going to let this cool down for a few minutes and then we'll remove it. And we're back once again. This has been on the sheet pan for a few minutes. Now with a thin spatula, we can loosen this off the sill pat, transfer it onto the cooling rack to let it cool down even more. It needs to firm up a little bit before we cut it into individual biscottis. And we're back once again. We have our cookies, the biscottis cooled down. This can get transferred onto a cutting board. I'm going to cut these the width of about this blade. I like to use a serrated blade, so I have to do a little bit of sawing. So I kind of just use the blade as a guide. They're definitely soft, like a traditional cookie right now. But the second baking is going to crisp them up. Well, that one's a little wider. We'll split that in half. We'll go back on the sill pat for another 10 minutes or so. And I tend to put the cut side up so it gets extra exposure if we can. If they're crooked, they'll fall. So single baking, just kind of a cookie, soft. It's the second baking that will crisp these up. We're gonna go about 10 minutes turn it from one side to the other. 10 more minutes. 350 oven. All right, first round of baking is done. 350, say 10 minutes. I like to flip these over if they can be. Let's get the other side crisped up. This might burn a little bit if it stays. These are a little bit softer than we'd like, so we have to recommend closer to 30 minutes for the initial bake. All right, and back in. Final baking, 10 minutes. All right, and this has been the final 10 minutes of baking on one side. These can now cool down before you eat. They may seem a little bit softer than some other biscotti, and that has to do with the chocolate chips inside. All right, that's the end of the demonstration.